Muscle contractions can be isotonic or isometric, and these isotonic contractions are subdivided into concentric and eccentric. Isotonic contractions is your typical muscle contraction, for example, flexing your biceps brachii, flexing your elbow, and it changes the length of the muscle. The concentric isotonic contraction, with that, the muscle tension rises until it exceeds the load. As the muscle shortens, the tension remains constant. So we'll see a graph of that in a second. An example of this would be flexing your elbow while holding a dumbbell. So here you can see the maximum tension produced. And you can also see that the speed of the muscle contraction decreases with increasing load. With the eccentric contraction, the peak tension is produced is less than the load, and the muscle will actually lengthen. An example of this would be returning the dumbbell from the flexed position to the extended position. When the contraction ends, the load stretches the muscle until the muscle tears or the tendon breaks or elastic recoil opposes the load. With the isometric contraction, this means that the muscle contracts, but the length does not change. For example, when you're driving your car, you can tense your abdominal muscles, and they're doing work, but you are not actually shortening those muscles. With these isometric contractions, the tension never exceeds the load. The contracting muscle bulges, but not as much as during the isotonic contractions. And again, the length of the muscle remains unchanged. Sources of ATP and fuel for muscles is a little bit tricky. In the muscle cell, they have a lot of mitochondria. And it is mitochondria that use... We always start with the molecule glucose, but actually any of the foods we eat can be broken down to some form that will then enter the mitochondria to produce ATP. Well, one source of energy is the beginning of that total breakdown. The glucose is completely broken down in the mitochondria, but partially broken down in the cytoplasm by glycolysis or glycolysis, sugar breakdown. In glycolysis, the glucose is basically split in half to form two pyruvate molecules. And this process is anaerobic, which means that oxygen is not required. It only produces 2 ATP. And of course the 2 pyruvate. Now, if those 2 pyruvate continue to be broken down further, they will enter the mitochondria, be broken down further, and you'll get much, much more ATP. 15 ATP per pyruvate, that would be 30 for a glucose molecule. A lot of ATP. So that process of glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. So the pink area here is the cytosol, and glucose is broken down by glycolysis to form 2 ATP and 2 pyruvate. This is anaerobic. The pyruvate then enters the mitochondria to be further broken down by cellular respiration, which is called the citric acid cycle, and this is going to produce CO2 and some ATP. It's also going to be further transported in the electron transport chain to produce the maximum amount of ATP. Oxygen is required for this process. Well, a lot of energy exists in your muscle cell so that you are ready when you need it. So there's quite a bit of energy reserved in glycogen. Our muscle cells and our livers make glycogen from excess glucose that we eat. It's a little bit like starch. It's the storage form of glucose in animals. And there's also going to be free ATP but not a lot. There's also going to be this compound called creatine phosphate that is produced when there's excess ATP. Another source of energy would be the glycolysis, that anaerobic metabolism, which only provides 2 ATP, and then the aerobic metabolism. So there are quite a few things that will produce energy for the muscle cell. At rest, the muscle needs very little ATP, so the mitochondria produce excess ATP. That ATP is used to convert creatine to creatine phosphate, which is eventually going to provide ATP when needed, and it's also going to convert glucose to glycogen for storage. When muscle metabolism is at moderate levels, the ATP demand increases, and most of the energy is going to be supplied by aerobic metabolism that the mitochondria do to make ATP. There's increased need for oxygen, and there will be no fatigue of that muscle fiber until the glycogen, the lipids, the amino acid reserves are exhausted. At peak activity levels, incredible amounts of ATP are required, but the mitochondria cannot work fast enough to provide as much ATP as needed. The rest is going to be provided by that very first step that takes place in the cytosol, the glycolysis. Here the glucose is broken down to pyruvate, but only 2 ATP are formed, and the pyruvate molecules. The 2 ATP molecules will keep the muscles functioning. It's not energy efficient, but it's going to work under anaerobic conditions. That pyruvate will be converted in the cell to lactate or lactic acid, and that is going to cause your muscle to become tired. When the muscle is tired, it is fatigued. The major factor is the decrease in pH. Remember that lactic acid is an acid, and that's going to lower the pH. It decreases the calcium troponin binding and alters enzyme activities. So the recovery period is the time needed to return back to normal, back to pre-exertion levels, and that may take quite some time. ATP production when oxygen is insufficient, such as maximum effort of exercising. Glycolysis produces ATP through an anaerobic means. It is fast, but does not give a lot of ATP. It's less efficient. It produces that lactic acid. It elevates the body temperature and increases sweating. When you stop exercising and you start breathing normally, eventually there's oxygen enough to get your mitochondria going again. So the lactate is converted back to pyruvate, and the pyruvate can enter the ATP and can enter the mitochondria to make ATP. The most efficient method of ATP production is aerobic metabolism, but it requires oxygen. – 70 to 80% of our body heat is produced by resting skeletal muscles. The Quarry Cycle is what happens to that lactic acid or lactate. It's the same thing. It's going to diffuse out of the muscle cells and into the blood, go to the liver, and be converted back to glucose. The liver converts the lactate back to glucose. The glucose will then enter the bloodstream and can get back to the muscle to be completely broken down in the mitochondria. oxygen debt is the amount of oxygen to come back to normal. So coming back to normal in a muscle fiber means restoring that original amount of ATP. It's not a lot, but restoring that, restoring the amount of creatine phosphate, restoring the glycogen levels. And in the liver, it's producing ATP to convert that lactate back to glucose. So here's that Quarry cycle. Takes place in the liver. The lactate diffuses out of the muscles into the blood, and in the liver, it's converted to pyruvate. The liver continues, during recovery, the liver continues to convert the lactate to pyruvate. 30% of the pyruvate is used to make ATP in the mitochondria. The ATP are then used to convert the remaining pyruvate to glucose, and glucose returns to the muscle cells.